welcome to the third seminar of this term. I'm very excited to welcome our neighbor and our colleague, Professor Sam Freeman from the Sociology Department. Professor Freeman studies class and inequality with a focus on the cultural dimensions of contemporary class division. He has published multiple influential and award-winning books, and his work has also appeared in top academic journals, including the American Sociological Review. Today, he will be talking about his latest book, Born to Rule. It came out last year with Harvard University Press and has already won the Economist Politics and Current Affairs Books of the Year 2024 and the Times Ideas Books of the Year 2024. So I'm personally very excited. So let's extend a warm welcome to Professor Freeman.
So much. It's really lovely to be here. I'm just literally half a floor up. So yeah, it's nice to hopefully get to know some of you, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions. Let me just. So I should say this is joint work with Aaron Reeves, who sadly can't be here today. But I want to start with a very British phrase: complete rubbish. Henry, a recently retired corporate lawyer, was visibly offended. For nearly 2 hours, he had talked amiably about a highly successful career in the City of London. But now, fairly instantaneously, the atmosphere had changed. We had just put a question to him that we put to nearly 150 people that we interviewed for this book. Do you consider yourself a member of the British elite? The frustration in his response, as you can see, was palpable. But something felt a little incongruous about Henry's outrage. Maybe it was that we were sitting in the drawing room of his 7-bedroom townhouse in Bloomsbury. Maybe it was the fact that we knew his wealth extended beyond £10 million. Maybe it was the huge self-portrait of himself that hung opposite us as we talked. Or maybe it was something about Henry's background and life trajectory. His father had a very senior post in the civil service, as had his grandfather. He went to one of Britain's most elite private schools. He had attended Oxford. And for more than 30 years, he had been a senior partner at a Magic Circle law firm. Or maybe it was just that as we spoke, and despite his protestations otherwise, it became abundantly clear that Henry was actually hugely influential. His personal networks included the governor of the Bank of England, a former chancellor of the Exchequer, and he spoke of various times in his career when he'd levered his position to lobby ministers. I should stress it's not that Henry was in any way arrogant or pompous. On the contrary, he was positively charming and thoughtful. But to us, at least, he seemed to be the embodiment of the British elite, both in origin and in destination. But clearly, and actually like the vast majority of the people that we spoke to for this book, this is not how he saw himself. He rejected the idea that privilege had had any significant role in his success. He talked up his working class ancestors. He belittled his influence. And he presented himself more generally as an exemplar of a more meritocratic era, both in the City of London and in Britain more generally. But what I want to argue today is that there is a dangerous disconnect between how people like Henry see themselves and what we discern when we carefully analyse patterns of elite reproduction in this country over the last 125 years. In many ways, I'm going to try and show the British elite hasn't changed a lot. It continues to be a fairly socially exclusive formation. And this matters because it has important implications for the elites we get. Not only do elites from privileged backgrounds tend to tilt to the right, politically and culturally, I'll show you, but these leanings are accentuated if, like Henry, they tend to combine positional power with extreme wealth. So why then are elites like Henry so keen to convince us of their ordinariness? One answer I'm going to try and suggest is that recent rises in economic inequality, particularly the pulling away of those at the very top, have made people like Henry insecure about their legitimacy. sensitive to public concern, that they are overly motivated by self-interest. In this context, public expressions of ordinariness, in the way you tell your backstory, in the way you express your cultural tastes, in the way you articulate your meritocratic legitimacy, arguably represent a logical strategy of impression management. Indeed, as I'll try and show, elites who successfully convince the general public that they have risen from humble origins or have mainstream cultural tastes are more likely to be viewed sympathetically by the general public as more relatable, as more intelligent, as more hardworking, even to some extent as more competent. There is, in other words, a symbolic market for ordinariness. So there you go, that's the kind of basic punchline of the book. I'm going to try and row back a bit now and tell you kind of how we're going to get there, and more specifically, what the questions are that underpin this project. So really, we wanted to ask a fairly basic research question here. How has Britain's elite changed over the last 125 years? More specifically, how has it changed demographically? Is it still dominated by the sort of caricature of wealthy public schoolboys? Also, is it still marked by the same culture? Does it think and behave in a particular way? Is there kind of ideological coherence at the top of British society? But of course, the starting point whenever you do a project like this is the thorny issue of what are we actually talking about when we deploy a term like elite? I think, you know, most people will be aware that popular interest in elites culturally, in terms of political discourse, has never been higher. But flanking this, as John Scott notes here, is often a kind of maddening conceptual fuzziness. We hear constantly, for example, on the right about the dysfunctions of the liberal metropolitan elite. On the left, we hear about the establishment. We're rarely told, though, where these formations actually start and finish. Social scientific definitions are similarly broad. This is perhaps the most influential in contemporary times, certainly the most cited. It comes from Seamus Khan, who argues elites are those with disproportionate access to and control over a range of economic, social, cultural, and political resources. Now, I think this is at once entirely reasonable, but it's also, you could say, somewhat unhelpfully inclusive, right? Certainly it means that when you look at the literature that derives from this kind of definition, there is this operationalization of very broad thresholds of eliteness, right? Often up to and including kind of 10, even 20% of national populations. Of course, there will always be challenges in identifying definitively this boundary between elite and non-elite. But in this project, what we wanted to do was kind of wrestle a more conceptually coherent definition. And in particular, I think, preserve an appropriate order of magnitude in identifying who those elite individuals are. So to do that, we draw primarily on Who's Who, which is the leading biographical dictionary of what they call noteworthy and influential people in the UK. It's been published in its current form every year since 1897, and it's consistently over time represented about 0.05% of the British population. Currently, that means about 33,500 entrants. And for us, it's coherent conceptually in the sense that it primarily documents an elite based on position. Okay, so this is an idea associated with the Italian scholar Mosco, who famously argued that elites are empowered through their ability to exercise authority over others and usually occupy top positions in organizational hierarchies. And so in this way, about half of the people in Who's Who are actually automatically included. So all members of parliament, all peers and judges, all ambassadors, all FTSE 100 CEOs, all national newspaper editors, all poet laureates, all fellows of the British Academy. These are all people who are included by virtue of their office. The other half are entrants who are also positional elites, but are selected based on reputation. So there's a board of long-standing advisors who make an assessment of an individual's kind of professional impact on British society. And they're looking really at this idea of a kind of sustained impact. So you'll see lots of kind of celebrities who've had a fairly short shelf life, not in there, but lots of people who have had kind of long-standing careers at the top of British society. But for many, perhaps who still feels like a rather large group to constitute a national elite. Indeed, if we go back to the Khan definition, elites are those with disproportionate access and control over a range of resources, right? With the implication here that these different forms of power often interact, they often accentuate one another. Whereas I think it's fair to say that many of the people, not all, but many of the people in Who's Who are only influential in one domain. So reflecting this, we wanted to go a step further and to try to identify people who really perhaps wield particular power within that elite grouping. So here we drew on classic elite theories, Marx, Pareto, C. Wright Mills, to sort of identify those who we felt have disproportionate control over both positional and economic power. So we defined in the book what we call the British wealth elite as those who are both in Who's Who, but are also people who are economically elite in the sense that they occupy the top 1% of the wealth distribution in this country. So that's about 6,000 people, or 0.01% of the UK population. How do we identify those people? Two ways. Historically, we analysed probate records in the UK, so that's the public record of people's wealth when they died. We match those people to people in Who's Who to identify those who are in the top 1% of the wealth distribution when they died. To identify today's wealth elite, we turn to a survey that we sent to people in the current version of Who's Who, where we asked them, among lots of other questions, about their total household wealth. So those are the elite groups that we're working with. How are we analysing them? What's our research design? So this is sort of has quite a lot of arms and legs. We're trying to do something here that's both longitudinal and mixed methods. So as I've already mentioned, we're first sort of marshalling a range of quantitative data. So we have the entire historical database of Who's Who. That's about 125,000 individuals. We have probate records, which allow us to look at the wealth of people in Who's Who, but also the wealth of their parents. We have a survey that we sent out to people, which asked a whole range of demographic and attitudinal questions to people in the current version of Who's Who, which also had some experiments that we ran through the survey. We also have an archive of Radio 4's Desert Island Discs, which I won't talk about a lot today, but if you're interested, I can say a little bit about where that fits in this. We're also trying to combine this with longitudinal qualitative interview data. So across the project, we have 217 interviews with entrants in Who's Who, and they are organized into 4 birth cohorts that cover the spread of the 20th century. So for the people born at the start of the 20th century, most of those were interviews that we derived from the British Library as part of the National Life Stories series, which we then matched to people in Who's Who. And a further 147 were interviews that were carried out by ourselves and our research assistants. Okay, so let's start with this issue of elite identity, this struggle to be ordinary, which I showed you at the start with Henry. So this came out in our data in a number of ways. First was via responses to the question that I mentioned at the beginning that we tended to pose right at the end of interviews, where we asked people whether they see themselves as part of the elite. And the vast majority of people strongly push back on this. You can see with Samantha here. Often, I would say, not only just pushing back, but actually often expressing a sense of being quite offended by this, often sort of quite aggressively pushing back. You might say this is fairly understandable, right? The word elite is almost universally used in a pejorative sense in public life, often sort of wielded as a kind of people in power who I personally disagree with. That's how it's sort of used. But I think this theme came out in more indirect ways too. One way, for example, was via narratives of progression and narratives of opening up, that essentially the elite world used to be closed, it used to be socially exclusive, but that things in this country have changed, things have become more meritocratic, and that they, the interviewee, are very much part of that shift. Now, it's worth saying that those comparative narratives are not necessarily about the recent past. Okay, most people we spoke to didn't think Britain had become more open in the last 20 years. But what they tended to do was pitch their comparisons to sort of earlier parts of the 20th century, as you can see Duncan doing here, arguing in this instance that the power of elite boarding schools as a kind of symbolic marker has strongly diminished over time. Another way that claims to ordinariness emerged was via, I would say, sort of fairly tortured conversations we had with people about their own backgrounds, particularly about their class backgrounds. And I would say this was particularly marked among those who we were speaking to who had fairly unambiguously elite backgrounds themselves, right? So you had Victoria here. She was really from fairly aristocratic roots, actually. And I think what you can see if you read through this quote is sort of the sense of how the discomfort around answering questions about class background. And this, we saw across the data, this sense that answers were kind of stilted rather than direct. They were often quite elaborate, but also quite vague on this topic. And it was actually telling that in our survey sample, 43% of the people who reported their class origin as working class on the survey responses, actually, when we asked them what their parents' jobs were when they were growing up, had sort of come from solidly middle-class professional managerial backgrounds, right? And like Victoria, many interviewees, I think, attempted to sort of deflect from or downplay aspects of their upbringing that might signal eliteness. So this is, sometimes this is via making comparisons with people in their orbit who were more advantaged, sometimes by presenting a kind of origin story via not really your own upbringing, but a sort of extended family history of kind of upward social mobility, of meritocratic striving. I think one sort of unusually frank conversation with Rachel, a charity CEO, illustrated this kind of contemporary sentiment. So she'd been educated at an elite private school, but actually explained that throughout her career, she had actually explicitly hidden her education from her colleagues, right? She'd even gone as far as omitting her schooling from her Who's Who profile. And so I think overall, there was this sense that instinctively the people we were speaking to wanted to tell or present themselves as having a kind of upward story, right? As having a meritocratic legitimacy for their eliteness, for their elite position. And I think what's interesting about that, because perhaps that's not a hugely surprising thing, is that this is where it was really interesting to go back to the narratives of elites earlier in the 20th century, where you really see something very different in relation to how they present themselves. This is just one example. Jeremy Morse, I should say these interviewees aren't anonymized because they are publicly available. He was a university chancellor. And you can see in a way, this is him just talking about his upbringing and the role that inherited wealth had played in his upbringing. And more generally, I think what this is representative of in the data was this sense of being much more at home in sort of inhabiting an upper class identity, often proudly parading inherited wealth, inherited privilege, and a sense of eliteness, right? That was something that you didn't try to in any way deflect from. That was actually something of a badge of honor. Why do we care about this turn to ordinariness social scientifically? Well, I think the primary reason for us was that what we were seeing qualitatively here seemed to directly contradict what we were finding quantitatively. So as I'm going to go on and talk about here, when we look at the propulsive power of elite origins, of private schooling, of Oxford and Cambridge universities as elite switchboards, there's actually been, I think, a narrative of remarkable continuity over time. So let's dig into that in its various dimensions. So first, what about this claim that we were getting from our interviewees that the British elite has strongly opened up over time? To get at this, as I mentioned, we looked at the power of elite origins by tracking down the wealth at death of parents of people in Who's Who, and used this to look at the proportion of people in Who's Who whose parents were in the top 1% of the national sort of probate wealth distribution when they died, or the top 10%. And so this figure basically on that front shows you two things. First, it shows you that clearly a disproportionate number of people in Who's Who come from fairly wealthy backgrounds. The black line at the bottom there in terms of the top 1% showing you about 15 to 20% come from the top 1% of the wealth distribution over time. But I think secondly, and more importantly for our purposes in a way, contrary to those elite narratives, the relationship between wealth and elite recruitment, I think, has stayed fairly stable over time. You see some decline in the middle of the 20th century, interestingly, the period perhaps where wealth was more aggressively taxed in this country. But basically, the story, I think, is somewhat more indicative of continuity. I should say that the white dots here are where we try to account for hidden wealth, which Neil Cummins, if any of you know, who's an economic historian here at LSE, has sort of written extensively about the degree of hidden wealth that starts to become important in terms of inheritances and probates from the mid-20th century. The remarkable thing about this continuity, though, is that it has taken place despite huge declines actually in the share of overall wealth distribution taken by the top 1% in this country over the 20th century. So this is a graph from Alvarado and colleagues. And essentially what's interesting, I suppose, is that despite being comparatively less rich than in the past, what our results here are showing is that the ability of wealthy families to propel their offspring into elite positions seems to have remained fairly constant. So looking at this in terms of relative risk ratios, if you hail from the top 1% of the wealth distribution, you can be consistently about 20 times more likely to reach the British elite than others in the UK population born in a similar cohort. Okay, so elite origins matter. What about our most elite private schools? So you may be aware that we have lots of tiers of eliteness in relation to our education system, particularly in the private sector. But these schools, known as the Clarendon schools, you'll probably have heard of Eton, but these are all very expensive, very old, traditionally male-only schools. Often seen as the kind of nurseries of the British elite. We wanted to look at how the proportion of people reaching the elite from these institutions has changed over time. And again, this is where the data in Who's Who is really nice, because unlike most survey data where you might get information about the type of school, here you have the individual school, right? So you can actually mine down to these individual institutions. So has the proportion of people reaching the elite from these institutions changed? Actually, yes. There is a notable decline story here. So these are 3 tiers of elite schooling. This is the whole independent sector, accounting for somewhere between half and 60% of all people in Who's Who across time. You have a tier here of about 200 schools that traditionally made up something called the Headmasters' Conference. So you can see this is only about 200 of several thousand schools. So you see a lot of the work in terms of elite reproduction is going on among the most elite private schools. And then this is those 9 Clarendon schools that I should say make up 0.19% of secondary school students in the UK. But you can see that certainly massively overrepresented in terms of the amount of students, the amount of people in Who's Who that went to these schools, but a notable decline from about 20% to about 10% of people in Who's Who over time. And I think that's noteworthy, but I also think there's a sense in which we shouldn't overstate it, that these schools remain extraordinarily powerful channels of elite formation. So even today, for example, the alumni of these 9 Clarendon schools are about 48 times more likely to reach the British elite than those attending any other type of school in terms of relative risk ratios. And this is actually further supported when we home in on more recent entrants to Who's Who. So this is looking at people included. This is, instead of looking at year of birth, now we're looking at year of entry to Who's Who. And the reason I wanted to show you is just to say that that decline story over the last 20 years has kind of stalled. Also, just want to make clear, we were also really interested here in looking at the power of girls' schools in this country. Often get much less press in relation to elite reproduction. But what we did here was look at a similarly sized grouping of very elite girls' schools. We worked with a historian to kind of Eve Worth to work out what would be the comparable set of schools to the Clarendon schools. But what you can see here, and this is looking at the power of these schools to propel women versus men into elite positions. Those at top girls' schools have been incredibly powerful, but they have never been as powerful for girls as boys' schools have been for boys in terms of getting into elite positions. Okay, finally, we wanted to look at the changing power of perhaps Britain's most well-known channel of elite recruitment, universities of Oxford and Cambridge. So here is just essentially the kind of proportion of people in Who's Who coming from different universities. We tried to distinguish here London Russell groups at LSE would be here. You can see them, interestingly becoming much more powerful in the latter part of the 20th century, but Oxbridge being sort of consistently recruiting about 30 or 40% of all elites in this country. But I think what's important to stress here is, like Origins, this stability needs to be seen in the context of huge changes in the number of graduates going to Oxbridge, right? So at the start of the period we're looking at here, over half of all university graduates in the country went to Oxford or Cambridge. And now it's about 1% of all university graduates. So when you look at that then in terms of the relative risk ratios of Oxbridge graduates going on to the elite, we actually see a very different story and an interesting story, I think, which we talk about in lots more detail in the book, where you see a sort of early decline of Oxbridge, but then an interesting, fairly powerful resurgence in the relative advantage of going to Oxford and Cambridge in more recent generations. Okay, I should stress this does not mean that there has been no demographic change in the British elite over time. Straight away, I think it's worth kind of pointing to the fact that on gender, there really is a very powerful opening up story, particularly since the 1980s. You can see about a third of new entrants to Who's Who now are women. But I think it's worth reiterating, right, that these rises are from incredibly low bases. Women are still strongly underrepresented. And I think what's striking thinking about our interview data is the sort of consistent misogyny and discrimination that most of the women that we spoke to had faced in reaching elite positions. On race and ethnicity, we see a modest story of increasing sort of diversity, particularly for Asian and British elites. Although I think it's worth stressing again that the British elite continues to be overwhelmingly white. So this reality, I suppose, of persistent demographic reproduction brings me back to this topic of ordinariness. So if elite narratives of opening up of meritocratic legitimacy are somewhat of an illusion, why then are contemporary elites so keen to present themselves as ordinary? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, our claim here is that there is a distinct market for ordinariness in British society. And I want to just explain what I mean here. And I'll do that by turning to the issue of elite culture and lifestyle. So again, one of the really nice things about Who's Who is that when people fill in their entry, they don't just input details about their education. They also have always had this section where you can input your recreations, right? What you like to do in your spare time. which is a kind of fascinating window into changing elite culture. But it's also really interesting social scientifically because this is a public document, right? This is a document that journalists are constantly using to find out information about important people, about their lives. So this is really a public performance of your cultural self, right? It's about how you want others to see or read you culturally. So our analysis here shows some interesting changes over time. So there's lots to say here, but I'll try and keep this fairly straightforward. Basically, the major shift we see in our data is that preferences for kind of highbrow culture, classical music, the arts, opera, etc., appears to dominate for much of the 20th century. But there's an intriguing shift to, among more recent elites, born really from the 1930s and 40s onwards, where you begin to see an increase in preferences for what might be considered more popular forms of culture, football, cinema, and a number of kind of practices, cultural practices, that perhaps we would consider fairly ordinary or mundane. So people start saying a lot that really what they do in their spare time is that they spend time with their pets, or they really care about their family and their friends, right? Which is a kind of interesting, I think, shift. But I would say it doesn't necessarily mean that they've abandoned their highbrow orientation. Instead, when we looked in these profiles at the way and the degree to which people combine different tastes or combine different sets of preferences, you see that actually the most powerful contemporary mode of elite culture is a kind of blending of highbrow and sort of ordinary pursuits. And I think what I would add to that is that there was often a residue, I think, of a more highbrow, perhaps even snobbish orientation that we detected in many interviews, often very carefully veiled. But what was interesting is that in many cases, there was a strong disconnect between the everyday tastes that we were seeing, right? We were going into these interviews knowing what these people had put in their public profiles, and the quite different persona that we were getting from the same individual in an anonymized interview, right? Which was often much more highbrow. So this is Amanda. She's been suitably anonymized, so there's no way you can tell who this is, right? But she told us in a who's who profile, you know, very sort of ordinary type profile. And then you have this really sort of passionate highbrow sensibility that came out in her anonymized interview, and that was really actually quite common. So these findings leave us, I suppose, with two linked questions. Why do these people struggle to be seen as ordinary in terms of their background or in terms of their tastes? And secondly, why does this performance of ordinariness seem to have become so salient in recent decades? So our answer to that first question is that successful expressions of ordinariness represent this form of currency. And to get at that and to try and sort of analyze it, we conducted a series of experiments. So here we took a nationally representative sample of about 500 people from the British population. And essentially the experiments were quite simple. We presented those people with short vignettes of imaginary elites, like the academics you can see here. We did this for our academics, CEOs, judges, and we asked them to rate these people on a number of different dimensions. So in this one, people were either given vignette A or vignette 1 or vignette 2. So in vignette 1 describes an academic from a working class background whose research interests were informed by their upbringing, or vignette B, which describes an academic from a privileged background whose research interests were informed by their upbringing. Everything else is the same, but the results were quite marked. So you can see here, people were, in the general population, were significantly more sympathetic to the academic from a working class background, rating them higher in all of these ways, right? And these were the things we asked them about: intelligence, hardworking, utility of research, etc. So in other words, elites who successfully convince ordinary people that they come from more humble backgrounds are likely to be viewed as more meritorious, as more relatable, as doing more meaningful work. Now, of course, that presupposes that people, people believe that performance of ordinariness, right? And that's a different matter. But I think the point, in a way, that I want to try and sort of, I don't know, suggest to you is that downplaying privilege then isn't just about this very British discomfort about talking about class and privilege. It potentially, whether consciously or not, and again, there's a question mark over the degree of intentionality here, but it potentially represents a very effective strategy of impression management for these very public-facing elite people, right? These are not economic elites who are, living very closeted lives. These are people who the nature of their eliteness is derived from a positional power where often they are responsible to or accountable to or answerable to much larger publics. But that doesn't necessarily explain why this performance of ordinariness is so marked among the contemporary elite, right? This shift over time, as I showed you in this. And our tentative argument, and I should say this is probably the most tentative part of our argumentation, is that the recent shift is connected to rises in economic inequality, particularly at the top end. So I suppose the thesis here is that as elites have pulled away economically, we suspect they've become perhaps insecure about their moral legitimacy in the eyes of the public. And, and so that's kind of a mechanism for driving up this sensibility. So that's sort of a very difficult thing to test, right? And so we were trying to think about ways to do it. And we again turned to a survey experiment, but this time it was with people in Who's Who. So we did this via the survey we sent to people in Who's Who. And what essentially we did was we asked them to imagine they were appearing on the Radio 4 show Desert Island Discs, which, if you don't know or haven't heard of it, basically elite people go on and they have to choose a series of songs and a book that they would take to a desert island if they were stranded there, right? We asked just simply to take what one track and what one book would you take and why. But for half of the people, before they were given that question, they got this primer, which was posed as a question, but it was essentially trying to prime them on the salience of inequality and their place in it. So they got this kind of question before, basically just underlining some stats and about the nature of inequality and their potential place in it. And then we compared how people who did or didn't get this described themselves culturally. And again, it's interesting, that actually when inequality becomes more salient, we did see that elites become less likely to say that their favorite track was a piece of classical music, less likely to choose a highbrow book, each by about 8 percentage points, right? Not huge, but an interesting signal, perhaps, that this kind of thing is having some impact. We also asked them about sort of why they would choose these things, and what you got, interestingly, was less emphasis on aesthetic criteria, right? Sort of formal, more highbrow criteria for why you would choose a book and a track, and a more emphasis on kind of nostalgic, sort of ordinary ways. That I've chosen this because it's linked to relationships, or it's linked to particular moments in my life. So I suppose the takeaway here is that when elites are reminded that they are the beneficiaries of rising inequality, our argument, very tentative, I should say, is that there is some evidence that they ramp up efforts to present themselves as ordinary. Okay, one final thing I wanted to touch on with you, which perhaps you've been thinking throughout, which is kind of who cares about any of this. Elites project ordinariness while remaining closed. Okay, but why does that persisting elite reproduction actually matter? Well, one key reason, certainly for sociologists over a long period of time, is that there's been this kind of hypothesis that where elites are drawn from very narrow social channels, they tend to act and think in certain ways, which have implications for politics, which have implications for the exercise of power. And, this is interesting at our particular juncture in this country because, we have had a sudden, very profound shift in the makeup of people in our cabinet, from a cabinet where 70% of people had been to private school to one in which I think it's about 14% among these people, and widely touted as the most working class origin cabinet. So in the last part of the book, what we try to examine is both whether the British elite is ideologically coherent, and we do that by drawing on an extensive set of survey questions we pose to people in the survey about their policy preferences. And again, the results here were quite interesting. And essentially what they showed us is that elite reproduction does matter, or does have an impact, at least attitudinally, on who elites are. Specifically, elites drawn from working class backgrounds do, at least attitudinally, tilt significantly to the left versus their colleagues from more privileged backgrounds. So they're less likely to believe economic growth should be one of the government's key policy priorities. They're more likely to believe the government should increase taxes on health, education, social security. They're more likely to believe the government should increase taxes on the rich. And they're also more left-wing on issues of race, on issues of empire, on issues of other kind of culture war issues around trans rights and feminism. Significantly, it's also important, I think, to note that this is the same generally for women in the elite. We see quite a strong gender effect on attitudes and for the elites of colour as well. And this is also where we see the importance coming all the way back to this sort of effort to try and distinguish or bracket out a wealth elite, because you can see that actually that group, remember that's people in who's who, also in the top 1% of the wealth distribution, they are significantly more right-wing than other elites. And I think this is important because, there's both a theoretical argument that wealth gives these people a particular ability to have an influence. I think we're seeing lots of examples perhaps of that right now, maybe not in the UK, but certainly in the US. But actually also in interviews, we were getting a sense of this among the people in the wealth elite that we interviewed. Typical kind of trajectory that I was getting from these sorts of interviews was people who had had very successful careers, but had decided, usually because they were independently very wealthy, to retire early and sort of take up a number of sort of non-executive board type positions to further perhaps philanthropic or cultural or distinctly political sort of pet projects that they had. And they were able to get those positions because of their positional power, but they were able to survive and actually take those positions for a long period of time where others wouldn't, because they were independent. Okay. Before I conclude, I just want to acknowledge that there is lots of problems with this work, and there's lots of holes, and we're trying to do a lot here, and I'm sure you've thought of lots of problems, and we have as well, and I don't want to sort of sidestep those, but here are some of the main ones, and do feel free to ask about them in questions. But just to conclude, I think the basic message that emerges here is that the contemporary British elite increasingly presents itself as ordinary. It does so often by setting itself against caricatured notions of a stuffy, closed, early 20th century elite. But this, we argue, performs an important signalling function, particularly in public, as the public are themselves more sympathetic to those they see as more humble, as more down to earth. But this process is pernicious because it strongly contradicts the empirical reality, right? Despite what elites may think about change, despite what they might have us believe about change in the various levers that they have for self-presentation for narrativizing their lives and the state of the nation. The reality is that the kind of stereotypes of Britain and its sort of power brokers being fairly socially exclusive, I think still largely holds. And I think shining a light on this gap between subjective perception and objective reality is important, not just because it sort of underlines the entrenched inequalities that remain in terms of who is able to reach elite positions in Britain, but I think it also provides tentative evidence that inequalities like this may then be implicated in the type of politics we get. So I think, to return to the very start, our key argument is that when people like Henry perform ordinariness, when they downplay their economic power, when they deflect privilege, they are, intentionally or not, and I think there's definitely, as I said, a question mark around intentionality, but intentionally or not, they are obscuring the very real differences in wealth and opportunity, as well as power and influence, that continue to separate themselves from everyone else. Okay, thank you.